Ready, Sam? So, on the 5th of July, 1884, a storm was raging in the South Atlantic Ocean. Somewhere between the Isle of St. Helena and the Cape of Good Hope, a small yacht called the Mignonette, with an equally small crew of just 4 men, was making its way down to South America. Their ultimate goal had been to loop around the continent, moving into the South Pacific Ocean to deliver this yacht to an Australian lawyer called Jack Want, funnily enough. They would never make it to Sydney Harbour. The captain, Tom Dudley, was an experienced and fairly well-respected sailor, where he was known, but the suddenness of the storm, combined with the fact that the Mignonette was a leisure vessel and built for inland journeys along the coastline, not long voyages out into the open ocean, meant disaster for all on board. Now, down below deck, the crew's cabin boy, Richard Parker, just 17 years old at the time, he had lied and told everybody that he was 18 so that he could go on this grand adventure. He was busy making tea when suddenly, and this is a direct quote from the transcript, a powerful wave smashed a hole in the side of the Mignonette. The crew had just 5 minutes to clamber up on deck, successfully lower the 13-foot dinghy, and safely get themselves inside the little dinghy before the yacht was below the waves and sinking fast to the bottom of the sea. Now, all 4 of them miraculously made it into the boat. There was a slight detour for our young Richard Parker, who fell overboard, but he was rescued by Captain Tom Dudley. He was the only man of the 4 who could swim, and he saved him either from drowning and shark attacks. So the 4 of them clung to this little dinghy until the storm had passed and the chaotic smashing waves grew calmer. They're still surrounded by sharks at this time, but for the time being at least, they were safe from the most immediate danger. Now, it was time to take stock of their lack of provisions, and I've just put up the photograph that was taken of the lifeboat. So throughout what I'm about to describe, this is where they were. So it's time to take stock of provisions. They had managed to take some basic navigational equipment, luckily enough for them, but there was no fresh water in the dinghy, and the only food that they had was 2 tins of turnips. This was now the most pressing issue. Once you lose 15 to 20% of your body weight in water without immediate medical intervention, this is fatal. And at sea, that means that the countdown clock starts now. They have roughly 6 days before their state of dehydration becomes so bad that they won't be able to recover. And these were long days, if not weeks, from land. Even if the weather was fine and they used all of their navigational equipment, this stretch of ocean, it had a lot of passing trade ships, but a 13-foot dinghy in the vast miles upon miles of ocean that surrounded them meant that although they had to rely on being found, they couldn't put much confidence in it. Rationing began immediately. In the first 3 days, the 4 men finished off the first of their 2 tins of turnips. On day 4, they had the extreme good luck of catching a turtle. By this point, all 4 men were extremely dehydrated, having drank no water, as they drifted along in the beating sun without anything properly to cover them all. The captured turtle was immediately killed, and the survivors drank its blood and finished off the second can of turnips. Now, to begin with, this might seem like a rash decision, but without any other viable drink, their mouths would begin to dry out, and it would have been both painful and difficult to swallow the dry contents of the last turnip tin in the days that followed. The days passed by, but without any rescue and no more roaming turtles. By day 12, there was no food left. The last of the turtle was eaten, and although the crew had made efforts to catch as much rainwater as they could in their oilskin capes, at the height of summer where they were in the world, there was too little, and the crew began to drink their own urine. It's at desperate times like this where the immortal words of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, "There is water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink," that seawater can begin to seem appealing. Richard Parker perhaps because he was the youngest and least experienced sailor amongst them, was less familiar with the horrors of drinking seawater. And, the mind is a powerful thing. There have actually been some accounts of people in similar situations upon drinking seawater actually believing that it's fresh. They talk to fellow crew members and passengers and say, no, it's fresh water, because their mind has tricked them into it. And, they think that they've drifted into, for example, just a really large freshwater lake. This, of course, was not the case. And any momentary relief that the body feels from the water, it's slim in comparison to the damage that seawater does in increasing dehydration and causing the kidneys to shut down. By day 16, Richard Parker was delirious. By day 18, the other 4 men began to discuss the custom of the sea, a legal custom in the established pattern of behaviour within a particular social setting. It is what is usual, not necessarily what is lawful. The custom of the sea is quite separate from like the strict laws of like maritime law. And it ended up being polite shorthand for cannibalism at sea, where shipwreck survivors would cast lots to decide who should be killed so that the rest might survive the ordeal. So, this year being 1884, the 3 other crew members being seasoned sailors, they will have known of the most famous cases of the custom of the sea over the century, including the fire of the Luxembourg galley, the sinking of the whale ship Essex, which inspired Herman Melville to write Moby Dick, and the prolonged mystery of the Franklin expedition's mission to make the journey through the Northwest Passage to unlock that new trade route. Of course, all of these ended with the custom of the sea, the last resort to sustain life. Even if Lady Franklin and Charles Dickens, who wrote a couple of articles in Household Words, couldn't imagine Englishmen eating each other, that didn't actually stop it from being true. The crew of the Mignonette could not have known that their experiences would dwarf the most famous stories of cannibalism at sea. Their conversation is apparently brief and in the abstract. They discuss killing and eating the weakest member of the crew. Captain Dudley and his first mate Edwin Stevens take to the idea, but Ned Brooke opposes it, and the matter drops. The next day, day 19, Dudley brings it up again, but instead of choosing amongst themselves who's best to die, he suggests the widely accepted lottery approach in custom of the sea situations of casting lots. Brooks, once again, refuses. Parker, obviously, was not an active part of these discussions, and that is because he was very much the weakest man on the boat. And it's at this point that he's either sick and subdued and close to death, or he might have fallen into a coma at this point. That's why we don't really hear anything from him. 25th of July, day 20 in the open boat, and Dudley decides that he cannot wait any longer. There can be no more indecision on this. It has been 8 days since the crew last ate, 4 days since Parker began to fall sick. Dudley decides to use a common utilitarian rhetoric, which happens in most custom of the sea situations. Who is worth more? So he decides to convince Stevens. He justifies the decision by saying, I have a wife and 5 children, you have a wife and 3 children, and it seems apparent to the 2 men that Parker has drunk too much seawater and that his death is inevitable. So this brings us to our next consideration. If Parker's death is inevitable, why don't the men wait a couple of days? It won't be comfortable, but they might be able to wait a couple of days until he dies of natural causes. They would still be cannibals, but they wouldn't be murderers. But unfortunately, as Renfield says, the blood is life. Around half of a unit of blood is made up of water. It is the only thing close to a safe water source on the dinghy. As soon as Richard Parker dies, his heart will start beating, the blood will stop flowing around his veins, it will sit, it will coagulate, it will pool. The crewmen would have a very difficult task of extracting the blood, even if they sat by him watching and waiting for the exact moment of his death. Whereas if they kill him while his blood is still pumping through his veins, they will be able to drink it, and they will be able to pass up casting lots amongst the 3 remaining crew members, at least for a couple more days. Dudley commanded Brooks to go to bed, and if you remember the size of the dinghy, that means, I think, just turning over. And so he lay down under some oilskin capes and reported afterwards that he attempted to fall asleep and was not involved in what happened next. But since the dinghy had 3 grown men and a 17-year-old boy in it, in a 13-foot long space, the fact that he knew what would happen seems clear to everybody. Dudley asked Stevens to hold down Parker's legs, bringing into question whether he was really in a coma or whether he was just weak from seawater consumption. And then Dudley took out his penknife and he slit Richard Parker's throat. The men had a cup ready to catch the blood that flowed out of the cabin boy, and despite Brooks's protest that he was asleep, he threw himself into the scurry for blood. That immediately satisfied their most immediate need, something to drink that would sustain them. After the killing, Parker's body was kept for food. They started on his organ muscles, his heart and his liver, the ones that had the highest protein levels that would help them recuperate their lost strength. Over the next 4 days, they would eat the rest of his body. On the 29th of July, day 24 on the open ocean, the dinghy was spotted and retrieved by a passing German freighter, the Montezuma. Now, the men must have felt that the worst of their troubles was past. They only had to report the ship as a loss as a result of the storm, explain that Richard Parker's death was one of necessity, as part of the usual part of the custom of the sea, before they could begin to make their journey home. But once again, they were swept off course by more powerful forces. Captain Dudley was candid about what happened on the boat, and it seems he told the story to anyone who would ask, from the captain of the freighter who picked them up, to local publicans, to the custom officer in charge of notifying the vessel's loss and circumstances, and lastly, to police constable James Laverty. He was in the customs house and he'd overheard the first retelling of this, and he had deep misgivings about Richard Parker's death. And so he especially asked Dudley to repeat his story, and Dudley repeated his story, going so far, apparently as he always did, of acting out the part of killing Parker with his penknife. So further suspicion of murder fell upon him when Laverty asked him if he could hold on to the penknife. He was planning on keeping it as evidence. And Dudley asked that he not keep it too long because he wanted a memento of his experience. So this is how the shipwreck of that little yacht, the Mignonette, and the journey of those 4 crew members and the death of a cabin boy became one of the biggest landmark cases in British history. Captains and crew were used to being honest about what happened at sea, how they had survived the worst of it. Occasionally, charges of murder were brought, but they were always dropped. The crew were all brought under arrest, and political movings at the level of the Home Office muddied the accounts right off the bat. Brooks was let off of all charges as a bystander as long as he promised to testify for the prosecution, to having understood from their behaviour that the 2 men intended to murder Parker. Further details became more difficult to pin down as to whether Parker was indeed in a coma and close to death, or whether he was sick but may have survived the ordeal if the crew hadn't chosen to live at the cost of his life. The jury was strong-armed into accepting that the men were either guilty of murder or to return a special verdict and return the case to the Royal Courts of Justice when it became clear that public opinion was in the favour of the survivors, especially after Richard's own brother shook the hands of all 3 survivors. After all, it was a known risk of going to sea, especially when the vessel was not fit for purpose. So 4 months after their ordeal at sea, the second trial was held in London, where the necessity argument was roundly picked apart. The necessity argument, with regards to the custom of the sea, was based on the idea that you could look out for your own self-interest, but there had to be an element of fairness to your actions. So the all-important lottery of casting lots, where someone would be picked at random to die and another to do the killing. Although, of course, this does ignore the fact that these lotteries were often rigged So if you trawl through instances where people have resorted to survival cannibalism at sea, you will notice a trend. The ship's captain is almost never chosen, nor is the surgeon or the cook who would be able to prepare the meal. And those who do lose the lottery are usually cabin boys or other young members of the crew who don't have any dependents. But the prime example used is what I like to call the Titanic door situation. So if two shipwrecked people are holding onto a piece of driftwood to keep themselves afloat, but it can't hold the both of them up, it will surely sink. Pushing or kicking the other person off wouldn't be considered murder, because to not would mean both people would die, and to not put active action into saving yourself would be tantamount to suicide. So the final sentencing of Regina versus Dudley and Stevens once and for all overturned this mindset when it was found that there could be no defence of necessity to a charge of murder under legal precedent or on the basis of ethics and morality. And here they are, a very dramatic, sensationalist view of what it must have looked like in the dinghy. So the conclusion read, "To preserve one's life is generally speaking a duty, but it may be the plainest and highest duty to sacrifice it. War is full of instances in which it is a man's duty not to live, but to die." So it would seem that the Titanic door situation, Jack Dawson's sacrifice for Rose, would actually be very much in line following the 1884 ruling, finding it preferable to give a life rather than endanger one. So after a lengthy trial and public opinion swaying between support for the survivors initially and condemnation sort of towards the middle and back and forth in newspapers, the end result was a sentence of 6 months in prison commuted from life imprisonment. So the practice of survival cannibalism at sea continued just because the law deemed it as trespassing on ethics and morality, did nothing practical for the people in the late 19th century and early 20th century who were in those situations, except survivors wouldn't as readily admit it anymore when they were rescued. So that's why there seems to be this sudden dip in those circumstances when you look through records. It's difficult to pull apart where exactly the anxiety over survival cannibalism comes from. Is it the horrific instances that put people in those positions, like the doomed raft of the Medusa, that was horridly created in the midst of another shipwreck, but the raft, which had to carry several hundred people, was already dipping below the waterline before even half the people were on board. And then when it became apparent that the two officer rafts wouldn't be able to tow it, they cut the lines and they left everybody behind, all the working classes behind, and they left them with crates of wine and a couple of tubs of biscuits that had been ruined by the seawater and left them to fend for themselves. Or does the raft of the Medusa actually inspire pathos? Was it actually things along the lines of Dudley's rather macabre behaviour, his repeated acting out of killing Parker, his need to keep the penknife with no apparent remorse that inspired this mistrust of survival cannibalism? Or is it the fact that it became a shameful act, one that was outlawed and seen as fundamentally un-English? In the words of the concluding statement of Regina versus Dudley and Stevens, "The duty in case of shipwreck of a captain to his crew, of the crew to the passengers, are duties that impose on men the moral necessity, not the preservation but the sacrifice of their lives for others, from which no country, least of all it is to be hoped, in England, men will ever shrink." Or is it the fear that people who have engaged in cannibalism, even for survival, have lost some fundamental part of their humanity, that they enjoyed the relief of food and drink from another person's body? That desire might become this secret, gnawing temptation that sets them apart from society forever. Now, the literary legacy of the mignonette and the subsequent legal battle is long. Now, the most well-known today, you'll probably have heard, is The Life of Pi, with the Bengal tiger named Richard Parker, in connection with the shipwreck from over 100 years prior. However, given how prominent the drinking of blood is in the story The Mignonette, and indeed the vast majority of stories of survival cannibalism at sea, it's strange that the evolution of the vampire in the long 19th century has been so infrequently viewed through the lens of the custom of the sea and its troubled history. In the shipwreck of Philip Aubin in 1756, the first mate reportedly exhorted the rest of the survivors to cut a piece out of his thigh and quench their thirst. The men of the Essex, drifting away from their ruined whaleboat, draws lots as to which should bleed himself to death to support life for the rest. And in the shipwreck of the Francis Mary in 1826, only 2 women were aboard the ship, Mrs. Kendall, the captain's wife, and her companion Anne Saunders. Now, when this ship runs aground in a storm, and it is a bad storm, nearly all of the ship got ripped apart, cannibalism became their only means of survival, with all of their provisions gone and the longboats thrown overboard. And here caste differences begin to show themselves, because while Anne Saunders helps her fiancé James Fry, the cook, to prepare the meat from those who have died, Mrs. Kendall stayed out of preparations. But where the two of them come together, certainly in the men's retelling of events, both women are characterised in a very sensationalist way. Mrs. Kendall is reported to have eaten the brains of a sailor, which either tells us how sensationalist it is, because the 3 parts of the body that people do not tend to eat is head, hands, and feet, because it does look so human and people find it distressing. So it was either very bad to have got to that stage, or because it makes for a good story. And so yeah, her husband, speaking for her, said that she said that the sailor's brains were the most delicious dish that she had ever tasted. Meanwhile, when any other member of the crew died, Anne would reportedly sharpen her knife, bleed the deceased from the neck, drink his blood, and cut him up. When James Fryer, her fiancé, died, the last of them to perish before rescues, a mate made a move towards the body to drain the blood from the corpse. Anne shrieked and, throwing herself at the man and physically fighting him, pleading her claim to, quote, the greater portion of his precious blood as it oozed and half congealed from the wounds inflicted upon his lifeless body. She claimed that she had a greater right to his blood as his fiancé, but graciously allowed the mate to drink 1 cup of Fryer's blood to her 2 cups. As a novel with a rich literary afterlife, Dracula has been read in a lot of different contexts, from religious readings of transubstantiation and blood drinking to concerns around bodily infections with syphilis and HIV, all approaching the character of Dracula as a symbol of either the persecutor or the persecuted, depending on the reading. Reading Dracula in the context of survival cannibalism, we can further explore the contemporary anxieties around cannibalism at sea, whether Dracula is himself a ghastly mirror image of humanity, pushed to the last resort, using waterways to infect vulnerable people from across the world, or whether he is a sympathetic reflection of humanity, a man who can only drink blood and is continually engaged in survival cannibalism, is, as always, the reader's decision. Now, the fear surrounding Dracula begins with his dominance over the narrative and his physical prowess. And so we all find ourselves once again on the Demeter, making its way under a veil of fog to London, to be at sea in this terrifying liminal state. As John Peck notes in Sea Voyage Narratives, death is a constant shadow. Until the ship reached its port, families or owners of land could not be sure of the present survival of the ship and crew, or of any individual on board. To go to sea during the age of sail was to run high risks. Ships foundered in heavy weather, collided in crowded estuaries, ran aground as a result of navigational errors, or were burned to the waterline by spontaneous ignitions of dangerous cargo. In the 2 decades between 1789 and 1899, David Markham calculated that 1,153 British ships went missing and almost 11,000 lives were lost. Through shipwreck, war, fire, or even ships sunk for the insurance, there is centuries-long associations between seafaring and loss of life. Stoker's research notes include a list of names found on Whitby tombstones of sailors and passengers lost or drowned since 1777, which runs to around 10 typed pages. For at least the semblance of order and control, on the high seas, a ship was its own kingdom and the captain the king. He had mastery over everyone and his word was law. If it did not pan out that way, things would end up being a disaster. In situations where decisions had to be made, things cannot be a democracy. So Dracula begins by contravening this cardinal rule. He establishes the ship as his own. Travelling in his earth box, Dracula brings his homeland with him everywhere. On the Demeter, which is meant to be an island in itself, the presence not just of Dracula as the creature, but the earth from the woods and mountains surrounding his castle is a kind of colonization of the ship. Dracula supersedes the captain's rule of the ship, corrupting the strict hierarchy of roles observed by maritime law, and this is before Dracula is even moved violently against the crew. It reflects once again the sinister and insidiousness of his power that builds slowly to a high pitch and then breaks, only to repeat time after time after time. When the Demeter is finally in Dracula's grip, terror, confusion, denial reign on this ship. The captain and the first mate try to comfort and threaten the crew in turn to try and regain control, but fear is the prevailing emotion. In the captain's log, as time goes on, he is forced to confront the truth of the situation, that there is something aboard the ship, picking off the crew members one by one, and yet there are yet more echoes of survival cannibalism here. So the captain is the last person to die on the ghost ship, and this is in part because he lashes himself to the wheel covered in protective items to ward Dracula away. But he was also most likely going to be the last person on the menu for practical purposes of Dracula's ultimate goal to get to England. When he reflects on the unsuspecting voyage of the damned, he echoes another common thought in the line of disasters at sea. He writes, "God forgive me, but the mate was right to jump overboard. It was better to die like a man, to die like a sailor in blue water. No man can object." There are often moments in the accounts of survivors where they envy the quicker death of drowning or burning that crew and passengers suffered at the beginning of whatever disaster befell them, rather than the stretch of long, slow days of dying of thirst and hunger, either being burnt by the sun with their skin blistering till it turns black, or made so cold that with so little bodily energy they can't keep themselves alive and they freeze to death. So here, the captain does not exactly condone his mate's suicide, but sees it as the lesser of two evils. There's almost a purity in his death. He isn't demeaned into becoming food. He is able to die like a man. This gives his decision some much needed weight, because so often in survival cannibalism, narratives, the survivors are either described or self-proclaim to be raving mad, unable to reconcile what they have done when they return to land, either psychologically or socially. So the captain's logs, the first mate's decision, as one of self-determination instead of an irrational response to a horrific situation, to die like a sailor instead of like prey, in the blue water instead of snatched by the fog, no man can object to. This distinction between man and beast often comes up in the taboo nature of survival cannibalism, despite the fact that many conversations are very rational, very practical, sometimes in the extreme, as we've seen when it comes to deciding who to kill. It's all very utilitarian a lot of the time. The weak over the strong, those with the fewest dependents opposed to those who have people to provide for, and those who do not fit into the in-group. So it's usually people who have been traveling the least amount of time or are somehow other to the larger group that you're running with. These conversations are often numerous as a decision is reached in these utilitarian terms to keep the greatest number of people alive. And here we have another mirror image between Dracula and the accounts of survival cannibalism. Once Dracula has had his fill on the ship and it drifts into Whitby's port, and an immense dog sprang up on deck from below, makes land, he runs in them before anybody can capture him, despite some local women attempting to set up a group to find the dog and take him in and care for him. In terms of the narrative, this makes sense that Dracula would use this form to come to shore. This way, he doesn't have to explain his presence, what happened on the ship, but the fact that he is in dog form instead of, I don't know, slipping away like a big bat or another one of his forms, I believe is another connection to survival cannibalism. When Captain Tom Dudley, rather unwisely, gave an interview on his experiences on the Mignonette to the Times, he describes the killing of Parker and the immediate aftermath. We was all mad wolves who should get the most, and for men, fathers of children, to commit such a deed, we could not have our right reason. Now, of course, Dudley and Stevens, despite their protests, were barred from using the temporary insanity as a plea in their court case as an escape route. But even from a practical point of view, insanity is the loss of reason. And as we have seen, Dudley reasoned on several different occasions why Richard Parker had to die so that they might live. The image of the wolves descending on Parker, though it's a little sensationalist as a way of distancing himself from that perceived act of inhumanity, it is still rather in tune with the natural world and with Dracula. So wolves are natural-born hunters, and they use the flux of their diet between feast and famine. They're known to attack without hesitation and gorge themselves on as much meat as they can find. This is especially true in late winter months, not only in Scandinavia, but in Britain and other countries across the world with notable wolf populations, which was just outside of living memory in Britain in the era that Bram Stoker was writing Dracula. And that is why traditionally January's full moon has been given the name the wolf moon. So we have focused specifically on survival cannibalism at sea in this talk and the underrepresented drinking of blood as part of the survival tradition that has gone mostly unnoticed in vampire literary criticism of the last 150 years or so. But of course, survival cannibalism happens everywhere, not just at sea. And if we are to take Dracula as the living embodiment of survival cannibalism, it's interesting to note the other settings that Dracula inhabits that are linked to survival cannibalism. So the novel begins with Jonathan's journey as he goes deeper and deeper into the mountain range. Now, before he even encounters the cacophony of howling wolves that shakes his nerves so badly while he gets to the castle, there are subtle hints laced through the narrative. Jonathan writes, "It was on the dark side of twilight when we got to Bistritz, which is a very interesting old place, being practically on the frontier of the Borgo Pass, leads from Bukovina. It has had a very stormy existence, and it certainly shows marks of it. 50 years ago, a series of great fires took place, which made terrible havoc on 5 separate occasions. At the very beginning of the 17th century, it underwent a siege of 3 weeks and lost 13,000 people, the casualties of war proper being assisted by famine and disease." Now, so far, despite all of my searches, and correct me if I'm ever wrong, I have not been able to find any factual account of this siege. But aside from the custom of the sea, the two other most common circumstances for survival cannibalism are on ice in mountain ranges, where Dracula's castle sits, or during times of upheaval like war, siege, crop damages, and shortages. And where there is siege, there is always famine. And where there is famine, there is survival cannibalism. Now, both examples are very well documented with wars and sieges across Europe, the colonial exploitation of the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, and other disasters like the infamous journey of the Donner Party across America in 1846. Incidentally, the year after the Donner Party was rescued, their campsite where they hunkered down and almost starved to death while eating the bodies of their loved ones became a popular picnic spot for Victorians, and it actually still is a picnic spot today. So, as you will see from literary criticism, there has been a long fascination with the image of the vampire as a blood drinker and the image of the zombie as a flesh eater. But as we have delved into the history of survival cannibalism at sea, it's clear that blood drinking is a crucial part of this practice in many circumstances. It's the driving motivation for people to kill for survival. The distinction between the blood drinker and the flesh eater has had its uses in Gothic studies, but I believe it's time to reevaluate that relationship to see the commonalities as much as the differences and how it reflects our most primal fear, but also, when it comes down to it, our most primal needs. Thank you so much, everybody.